Let her go." Nathaniel Corbin's voice cut across the yard before dawn had fully broken through the pines. And he came down the porch steps 2 at a time, his shirt hanging loose, his bare feet pressing into the cold morning earth. 2 unfamiliar men had Odessa Vane pinned against the well-post, her wrists bound with rope, while a third stood back near a covered wagon clutching a folded document, a crooked tin star pinned to his coat. "Remove your hands from her before I lay you in the ground myself." The man with the paper remained unflinching. "This woman is claimed as the escaped property of a Mr. Ezra Cullen of Bort District, matching the description of a runaway named Diner. Sought these past 11 months. The law is behind us, Mr. Corbin, whether you approve of its appearance or not." The ensuing silence pressed heavily upon a man's ears. No one on Millbrook had ever heard the master raise his voice in such a manner, not even during the dark months following his wife's death, but to comprehend how a quiet, methodical plantation owner in the South Carolina Midlands came to position himself between a bounty hunter's rope and a woman the entire county had resolved to despise. One must journey back several months to the day it all commenced. Now, allow me to relate how it all unfolded. South Carolina. In that particular year of 1852, the cotton had already reached knee height by the second week of May, and the heat settled over the low fields like something substantial. Thick, wet, and unending, the kind of warmth that made mules obstinate and dogs sprawl flat in whatever shade they could find. Nathaniel Corbin, 30, 4 years old and a widower these 3 long years, stood on the porch of Millbrook House, clutching a letter, reading it for perhaps the 5th or 6th time that morning, though he already knew every line of his mother's handwriting by heart. Before we proceed further, if this tale has already captured your interest, take a moment to subscribe to Veil of Fear and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now back to South Carolina, because what was about to arrive at Millbrook would alter the course of every life on that land. Margaret Corbin had never been a woman to abandon a matter once she'd determined it required fixing. And what required fixing, in her estimation, was her son's empty house. Since Sarah had perished bringing their first child into the world, and the child with her, Nathaniel had operated Millbrook the way a man flees from something. Up before dawn, in the fields until darkness, the ledgers open on the kitchen table long after supper, as though enough columns of figures could fill a room that grief had hollowed out. Margaret had written to an old family friend, a widow named Adelaide Poot, who maintained a respectable house in Charleston, and, among her various occupations, arranged introductions between good families and young women of quality seeking a settled match. Mrs. Poot had a grandniece, Louisa, 19 years old, and by every account delicate as spun sugar, pale and soft-spoken, the kind of bride Margaret believed might finally coax her son back into something resembling a life. The plan was straightforward enough on paper. Louisa would travel down from Charleston by carriage, properly chaperoned, and stay a fortnight at Millbrook, allowing her and Nathaniel to become acquainted with an eye toward marriage before the year's end. Letters had traversed back and forth for 2 months arranging it, Margaret's handwriting growing more triumphant with each one, until the morning the carriage finally turned up the long drive under a sky already hazing white with heat, and the door opened. And what stepped down was not the pale, slight figure everyone at Millbrook had been envisioning for weeks. She was a black woman, and she was tall in a manner Nathaniel had genuinely never observed in another human being, standing well over 6.5 feet. Her shoulders were broad and her arms clearly no strangers to hard labor, and yet she descended from the carriage step with an unhurried grace that rendered the entire yard silent. Her skin was a deep, warm brown, her hair pulled back close beneath a plain cotton head wrap, and she wore a simple gray traveling dress. Well made, though far from fashionable, that had plainly seen a great many miles of road. Her name, as it turned out, was Odessa Vane, and she was not Louisa Pute, and she was not anyone's intended bride at all. Margaret Corbin stood frozen at the top of the porch steps, one hand pressed flat against her chest, as though she might physically hold her composure in place. "There has been some manner of mistake," she said, her voice climbing half an octave above its usual register. "I wrote most particularly to Mrs. Pute for a young lady of delicate constitution." She stopped herself before the word could finish leaving her mouth, though everyone standing in the yard understood well enough what she had swallowed back. The driver, an older black man named Cato, who had traveled the Charleston road more times than he could easily count, climbed down to attend to the trunks, keeping his eyes carefully on his work and out of the conversation entirely. He had learned long ago that the safest place for a driver to be in moments like this was somewhere other than in the middle of it. The truth of it emerged within the hour, delivered by Odessa herself, in a voice that did not waver, even as half the household stood gathered on the porch to hear it. Louisa Pute had taken a fever 2 days into the journey, stopping at an inn outside Orangeburg, too ill to travel another mile. And rather than send the carriage back to Charleston empty and lose the arrangement Margaret had worked 2 months to build, Mrs. Pute had asked Odessa, her most trusted employee, a free woman who had managed the Pute household's correspondence and accounts for the better part of 6 years, to go on ahead in her place, carrying a letter of explanation and an offer to stay a week or 2 helping the Corbin household prepare until Louisa was well enough to make the journey herself. "I never told anyone. I was the young lady you were expecting, sir," Odessa said to Nathaniel directly, holding his gaze without apology, a folded letter and a small leather document case in her hands. "Mrs. Pute's letter will explain it plainer than I can. If my being here is an inconvenience, I'll trouble you for nothing more than a seat in tomorrow's mail coach back to Charleston." Margaret, standing rigid at the top of the steps, made a small strangled sound that was not quite words. It was Nathaniel who came down to meet her, who took the letter from her hand, instead of simply reading it over her shoulder, as would have been proper, and who said in a voice that surprised even himself with its steadiness, "There's no need to trouble anyone about a mail coach today. You've had a long road. Come in and sit, and we'll sort the rest out after." That evening, once the house had quieted and Margaret had retired to her room with a headache that was more temper than illness, Nathaniel sat across the supper table from a woman his mother had already, within earshot of the whole kitchen, begun calling that dreadful mistake. Odessa ate without apology and answered his questions plainly. She had been born free in Virginia, she told him, her mother having purchased her own freedom, and then, years later, saved enough from taking in washing to buy Odessa's, as well before the girl had turned 12. She had gone into service with the Pute family at 16, had taught herself figures and letters well enough that Mrs. Pute trusted her with the household books, and had never, in 15 years of living free, expected to find herself standing on the porch of a cotton plantation in the Carolina Midlands, being mistaken, however briefly, for someone's bride. Mrs. Pute thought, "Perhaps you needed more than a wife who could sit pretty at your table," Odessa said, and there was the faintest, careful humor in it. "Your mother's letters made you sound like a man drowning quietly in his own account books." Nathaniel found himself laughing before he'd decided to, the first laugh in longer than he could easily place. My mother writes entirely too many letters. Mothers rarely know when to stop, Odessa said, and something close to a smile crossed her serious face. Among Odessa's few possessions was a small folded document she carried always in an inner pocket of her dress close against her body. Not the letter from Mrs. Poot, but a single sheet of paper worn soft at the creases from years of handling, bearing her mother's careful signature and the notarized mark of a Virginia court clerk. It was her manumission paper, the proof on a single fragile page that she belonged to no one but herself. She had been taught from the time she was old enough to understand what the paper meant, never to travel without it, never to let it out of her sight, and never, under any circumstance, to assume that carrying it would be enough. Nathaniel would not learn the full weight of what that paper had cost her mother until many months later, when the question of Odessa's freedom would become a matter for a federal commissioner, rather than a private conversation over supper. The first full day of Odessa's stay at Millbrook began before dawn, out of habit more than necessity. She came down to the kitchen expecting to find it empty, and instead found Patience, the cook, already working the fire, setting a skillet to heat for the morning's cornbread. "You rise as early as I do, I see," Patience said without much surprise, passing over a cup of chicory coffee. "That's a good sign. Ain't no room here for folks who wait on the world to serve itself to them. I've risen before the sun my whole life," Odessa answered, taking the cup in both hands. Hard habit to unlearn. Patience studied her a moment over the rim of her own cup, the kind of unhurried, appraising look that took in more than most people's careful conversation ever managed to reveal. "You're not what the house was expecting. That much is plain to see." Half the kitchen had a bet running on what Miss Louisa Poot would look like. "Nobody guessed you." "I don't imagine they did." Odessa allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I didn't guess it myself 3 days ago." "Well, whatever brought you up that road, you're here now, and here's as good a place as any to start the morning." Patience nodded toward the hearth, where a pot of hominy had begun to bubble. "You want to make yourself useful. There's grits need stirring so they don't catch on the bottom. I've burned enough pots in my life to know a body who looks like she'd rather be doing something than sitting idle." Odessa took up the spoon without being asked twice, and the two women worked in a companionable wordless rhythm for a while, the fire popping, the smell of cornbread beginning to fill the small kitchen. It was Patience who broke the silence again, her voice quieter now, testing the ground between them. "You're free," she said, not quite a question. "I am. Born free in Virginia. My mother bought her own freedom first, then mine a few years after." Patience nodded slowly, stirring her own pot, her face giving away little of what she was thinking. "Must be a strange kind of freedom, though, walking into a place like this one. Free enough to leave whenever you please, and still not free of what folks see when they look at you." Odessa considered that a long moment before answering. "No, I don't suppose I ever will be, but I'd rather carry that weight free than not free at all, if those are the only two roads offered to me." "Can't fault you the arithmetic there," Patience said, and something in her tone had softened just slightly toward something that might with time become trust. Patience was enslaved, a fact that sat plainly and painfully between the two women from that very first morning, unspoken but never quite absent, a difference in their situations that neither pretended did not exist. Patience had been born on Millbrook's land, had buried a husband sold south 4 years past, and ran the kitchen with an authority that no one, not even Margaret, cared to challenge. She and Odessa did not become friends that first morning, but something in the careful, clear, eyed way each woman, took the measure of the other, left the door open for it. And over the weeks that followed, that door would open wider than either expected. By the second day, word had already traveled from the kitchen through the fields that the woman who'd arrived instead of the bride knew her letters. It was Isaiah, the elderly man who had run the day-to-day work of Millbrook's fields for longer than Nathaniel had been alive, who came to her cautiously that evening, asking on behalf of his young grandson whether it was true. "It's true," Odessa told him. "But you understand what you're asking me to risk, teaching a child his letters in this state. It's against the law here, Isaiah, and has been near 20 years. "I understand it fine," the old man said, his voice low and steady. "I'm asking anyway." She taught the boy his first letters in the dirt behind the smokehouse with a stick after dark for 3 nights before Isaiah judged it safer to stop. And though it was a small thing, a handful of hours in the dust, it was the first time in longer than she could remember that Odessa had felt entirely certain she was doing something right, law or no law. On the third day, Nathaniel found an excuse, transparent enough that even Isaiah, watching from a distance, had to hide a smile, to ask Odessa's opinion on a set of curtains for the dining room that had been fraying unattended for the better part of 2 years. They spent the afternoon over fabric samples, neither of them much cared about, and neither mentioned aloud what both of them understood perfectly well, that the curtains were not really the reason for the conversation at all. By the 4th day, Margaret had exhausted her patience for waiting the problem out, and tried instead a more direct approach, calling Odessa into her sitting room and offering her a small purse of coin to spare everyone the awkwardness of a longer stay. Odessa looked at the purse and then at Margaret and did not reach for it. "With respect, Mayam, I didn't come here chasing money, and I won't leave chasing it either. If your son asks me to go, I'll be on the next coach without a coin changing hands. But while it's him deciding I should stay, it'll be him deciding when I go, not you." Margaret, furious at being refused so plainly, put the purse away and did not attempt it again, though she did not stop looking for other ways to be rid of her son's unwelcome guest. In the weeks that followed, a letter arrived from Charleston not long after, addressed to Margaret in Mrs. Poot's careful hand, reporting that Louisa had at last recovered, fully from her fever, and stood ready, whenever it suited the Corbin household, to complete the journey originally intended. Margaret seized on the news with visible relief, certain it would resolve at a stroke the awkward situation that had settled itself over Millbrook these past weeks. "You see," she told Nathaniel over breakfast, waving the letter as though it were proof of some argument long contested, "the matter can be set entirely right within the fortnight. Miss Poot can travel down as originally planned, and Odessa can return with the same coach, and no one in the county need think another thing about any of this unfortunate business." Nathaniel set down his coffee, with rather more care than the cup required. "I have no intention of sending for Miss Poot, Mother. Whatever arrangement you and Mrs. Poot settled between yourselves, I never gave my own word to it, beyond agreeing to make her acquaintance, and I find I have no wish to make it now." Margaret's face went through several expressions in quick succession, before settling on something between disbelief and fresh outrage. "You mean to simply humiliate the girl, then, after Adelaide Poot went to the trouble of arranging the whole visit?" "I mean to write to Mrs. Poot myself plainly and with proper courtesy, explaining that circumstances have changed rather more than any of us anticipated, and that Miss Poot's own prospects will be far better served elsewhere, with a man who can give her the attention she deserves, rather than one whose heart was never fully available to give. He did write that letter within the week, careful and honest in a way that left no ambiguity, and Mrs. Poot's reply, when it came, surprised Margaret rather more than it surprised her son. A warm, entirely gracious letter expressing no offense whatsoever, and closing with a line Nathaniel read aloud at supper with poorly disguised satisfaction. I confess, Mr. Corbin, that when I sent Odessa ahead in Louisa's place, some small unspoken part of me wondered whether it might turn out to be the truer match after all. I find I am rarely wrong about such things, and I am glad on this occasion to have been proven right. Margaret said nothing further on the subject of Louisa Poot after that, though it would be a good while yet before she stopped finding other subjects to raise in her place. Each one in its own way another quiet attempt to remind her son of the life she still believed he ought to be living, instead of the one he seemed increasingly determined to build for himself. It was in the account books that Odessa first proved herself indispensable, in a way no one at Millbrook could easily dismiss. Left alone one afternoon in Nathaniel's study, while he sought business in town, she found herself, out of habit rather than any intention to pry, glancing over the open ledger on his desk, and noticed a column of figures for blacksmith repairs that didn't sit right against what she'd overheard the smith himself say in the yard that same week. Forgive me for saying so, sir, she told Nathaniel that evening, but these numbers from March don't match what was actually paid out. The ledger shows $18 for the wagon axle repair. The smith told your man Isaiah plain as day that he only received $12. It took 2 days of quiet checking to confirm what Odessa's sharp eye had already caught. That Millbrook's overseer had been padding minor expenses for the better part of a year and pocketing the difference. A theft no one else on the place, not even the endlessly careful Nathaniel, had noticed. She went about it methodically, comparing the ledger entries against the smith's own account book, which she borrowed under the pretense of settling an unrelated bill, and against the recollection of 2 field hands who had been present when the axle repair was paid for in coin, counted out in front of them as a matter of the overseer's habitual carelessness with discretion. It isn't only the axle, sir, she told Nathaniel on the second evening, laying the ledger open between them on his desk, her finger tracing down a column of small, unremarkable figures. There's a pattern to it once you know to look. Small amounts, never large enough on their own to draw notice. A few dollars here for feed, a few there for tool repair. But added together across a year, it comes to nearly $90 that never left this house for the purpose the book claims it did. Nathaniel stared at the figures a long while, feeling something between anger and a peculiar, unwelcome embarrassment that he had overseen these same books himself for years, without once catching what a woman new to his household had uncovered in a matter of days. 90, he repeated. And how long has Mr. Dawes been managing this place? 4 years, by Isaiah's account. I'd wager if you had the patience to go back through the older ledgers, you'd find the pattern stretches further than this single year. It did. 3 years further, in fact, once Nathaniel forced himself to sit with the older account books late into the night, Odessa beside him with a second candle, the 2 of them working through columns of figures until well past midnight. The overseer, confronted the following morning with the evidence laid plainly before him, offered no real defense beyond a sullen insistence that every man in this county skims a little, it's only sensible, and was dismissed from Millbrook within the week, gone by wagon before the sun had set on his last day. From that same day forward, Nathaniel found himself asking for Odessa's opinion on far more than curtains, consulting her on matters of the household, and increasingly matters he had no real business discussing with a guest at all. The fair treatment of the people working his land, the handling of the corn stores during a lean month, decisions he had always made alone, and now found he did not want to make without her. It was around this same time that Odessa first encountered the harder edge of what her presence meant to the wider county. Nathaniel had asked her to accompany him into town to select fabric for the dining room he'd been so determined to redecorate. And the moment they stepped into the general store, she felt every conversation in the room fold in on itself, felt the weight of stares settling on her height, her color, the plain fact of her existing in a place that had already decided what to make of her before she'd said a single word. Would you look at the size of her? One woman murmured to another, not troubling herself to lower her voice. Hardly seems decent, a woman built like that. I don't suppose any husband would have her. Built more like a man than a woman, if you ask me, the second woman added, and the two of them laughed behind gloved hands, not quietly enough to matter. Odessa felt the heat rise in her face, but held herself steady, as she had learned to do since childhood. Fixing her eyes on the bolt of blue calico Nathaniel had asked her opinion on, refusing to give either woman the satisfaction of a reaction. It was Patience who had come along to help carry parcels, who did not hold her tongue. Mind that mouth. Clara Sims, wasn't it your own husband left you for the Whitfield girl, not 2 years past? I don't go round announcing your business, so you'd best leave mine be. The woman flushed a deep ugly red and said nothing further, gathering her own parcels and retreating toward the door with as much dignity as she could manage, which was not a great deal. The storekeeper, a thin, nervous man named Holsey, who wanted no trouble whatsoever in his shop, busied himself very intently with a shelf of tin buckets that did not require his attention at all. Nathaniel, who had watched the whole exchange without quite knowing how to step into it, felt a confusion of shame and admiration in equal measure at the ease with which Patience had defended a woman she'd known only a matter of weeks. You didn't need to do that, Odessa told Patience later back in the kitchen. I've been fending for myself a long while. I know you have, Patience said, but it's no shame to let somebody else carry a little of the weight now and again. Doesn't make you any less strong. From that day on, Nathaniel began consulting Odessa on more of the plantation's daily business, and it was Isaiah watching the change in his employer from the shade of the porch one evening who first spoke plainly about what he'd observed. Never seen you laugh like that, Mr. Nathaniel, not since Miss Sarah passed. It isn't a laughing matter, Isaiah. It's that for the first time in 3 years, someone in this house speaks to me plainly, without trying to flatter me or manage me. Begging your pardon, sir. But that's exactly what you've been needing since we buried Miss Sarah. Somebody willing to tell you the truth even when it isn't comfortable. But the county of which Millbrook was a part did not easily forgive a man who bent its unspoken rules. And before long the whispers that had started in the general store would stop being merely whispers. The first warning came as a stone through the window of the small room off the kitchen, where Odessa slept, thrown sometime after midnight on a moonless night in late June. No one was hurt, but the scrap of paper wrapped around the stone made its meaning plain enough in crude, uneven letters. The big black woman putting on airs at Corbin's had best be gone before the county decided the matter for her. Nathaniel wanted to ride into town at first light and find out who was responsible. But Odessa asked him, with the calm of someone who had faced this particular threat in other forms before, not to make a public matter of it. If you go raising a fuss, sir, It's me who pays for it, not you. That's how it's always gone. The town forgets who threw the stone. It never forgets who got hit by it. That sentence stayed with Nathaniel for days afterward, turning over in his mind as he rode the fields or sat with his ledgers at night. He had lived 34 years without ever once questioning the world he'd been born into. The rigid lines between who could sit at whose table, who could speak plainly, and who was expected to defer, the quiet, comfortable assumption that certain lives simply counted for less than others by the mere accident of birth. Now, watching Odessa cross the yard each morning with her chin level, despite the stares that followed her, he began to understand that his entire education had been at best a comfortable lie he had never troubled himself to examine. The morning after the stone came through her window, Odessa found her small traveling bag already half packed, folded neatly on the bed. Before she quite realized her own hands had done it. It was not fear alone that moved her. She had weathered worse than a thrown stone in her 15 years of freedom. But a clear-eyed calculation of the kind she had been taught to make since childhood, that her presence in this house was costing Nathaniel Corbin a peace he had not asked to lose, and that the kindest thing she might do was remove herself before the cost grew any steeper. Nathaniel found her in the kitchen before first light, the bag already carried down and set by the door, and understood at once what it meant. "You're leaving," he said, not quite a question. "I think it best, sir, before this goes further than a stone through a window." "And where would you go?" "Back to Charleston, to Mrs. Pute, until Miss Louisa is recovered, and this whole misunderstanding can be set right, the way it was always meant to be." Nathaniel crossed the kitchen, and for the first time since she had arrived took both her hands in his, an act of plain forwardness that surprised them both. "Odessa, if you leave because you're afraid for my sake, I understand it, and I won't hold you here against your will. But if any part of you is leaving because you believe I want you gone, I need you to hear me say plainly that it isn't true. Not one part of it." She studied his face a long moment in the gray pre-dawn light, searching. He understood, for the same thing she had been searching for since the morning. She stepped down from that carriage, proof that his words matched something real underneath them, and not merely the comfortable manners of a man unused to being told no. "I'm not accustomed to being wanted, Nathaniel," she said finally quietly. "Not truly wanted for exactly what I am, and not for what use I might be put to." "Then let me be the first to make you accustomed to it," he said, "for as long as you'll allow me to try." She did not leave that morning, though the bag stayed packed by the door another 2 days, before she finally, without either of them remarking on it aloud, unpacked it and returned it to its shelf. Margaret, for her part, had not given up hope of ridding the household of her unwanted guest and wrote, instead, to an old family acquaintance, a neighboring landowner named Silas Whitmore, inviting him to visit under the pretense of discussing a joint contract for cotton transport, in the private hope that his presence might remind her son of the kind of match that properly suited his station. Silas arrived a week later on a fine black horse, all smooth manners and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, dressed in a coat too finely cut for a simple business call, and made his opinion of Odessa clear before the first evening supper was through. "It's remarkable, Corbin, the liberties you allow that woman in your house," he said over the meal, not troubling to address Odessa directly, even as she stood serving at the sideboard. "On my place, a woman her size and her condition would be out working the fields under the sun, not pouring wine for company." "Her condition, Mr. Whitmore." Odessa's voice was level, but there was steel beneath it. I wasn't aware freedom counted as a condition requiring correction. Silas turned in his chair, apparently surprised the sideboard had spoken at all. A figure of speech, nothing more. Though I confess I find it curious. A woman of your build finding so ready a welcome at a respectable man's table. Where I come from, we're taught to be cautious of what looks too good to be entirely natural. Where you come from, Mr. Whitmore, I understand a man's cautions are for sale to whoever offers the highest price for them. Odessa replied, and set his wine down with rather more force than strictly necessary, though not enough to spill a drop. Margaret gasped audibly. Silas's smile thinned, but did not entirely vanish. A sharp tongue as well as a sharp eye for figures. You've collected quite the curiosity, Corbin. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Margaret held her breath, certain her son would correct such insolence at once. Instead, Nathaniel merely smiled faintly beneath his mustache and changed the subject, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind, without a single further word, exactly where he stood. Later that night, once the guests had retired, Margaret came to her son's study in a fury. Do you understand what people will say, Nathaniel? Silas comes from good land, a respected name, and you'd rather humiliate him at your own table over a servant who wouldn't even be here. She's no servant of mine, Mother, and I won't apologize for refusing to let her be spoken to in my house, as though she has no right to answer for herself. Is it that you've formed some attachment to her? The question came sharp, an accusation rather than a mother's simple curiosity. Nathaniel did not answer at once, weighing the words carefully. The truth was that he had spent weeks now unable to fully name, even to himself, what he felt toward the woman who had arrived by mistake and stayed by his own choosings and admiration, a curiosity, something deeper still that he had not yet dared speak aloud to anyone, least of all his mother. I feel, Mother, that she is the only person in this house who speaks to me with the whole truth, without polish or self-interest, he said finally. And that is worth more to me than anything Silas Whitmore could offer in land or cattle or name. Margaret left the study without another word, though the set of her jaw made plain the conversation was far from finished. Silas returned to his own plantation days later, stung by the public slight, but not before warning with a cold smile that promised nothing good that. This county has its order, Corbin, same as it's always had, and that order has a way of settling itself on people who forget it. Margaret, resigned for the moment to her son's stubbornness, watched and waited in silence, certain her opportunity would come again. It was in the weeks of quiet that followed that Nathaniel and Odessa began, almost without meaning to, building something neither of them was yet willing to name aloud. They took to sitting on the porch in the evenings, after the day's work was done, watching the light go gold and then violet over the cotton fields. And it was there that each began sharing pieces of the other's grief that neither had spoken of before. Nathaniel of Sarah, of the fear that had kept him buried in ledgers rather than risk feeling anything so deeply again. Odessa of her mother, gone 11 years now, of the childhood spent knowing that no matter how carefully she carried herself, the world had already decided what her size and her color meant before she'd said a single word. The hardest part, she confessed to him one evening as the first stars came out over the fields. Who'sn't the labor? I've never once minded honest work. It's that people decide who I am before I've opened my mouth to tell them otherwise. They see my height, my skin, and they think they already know the whole of my character, my worth, my future. I don't, Nathaniel said quietly. I want to hear it from you, Odessa. Not what the county whispers about you. My mother used to say the same thing near the end. Odessa went on, her voice softer now, further from him than the porch. She'd worked herself thin, buying first her own freedom, then mine. Couldn't folks in Richmond still cross the street rather than walk near her? Freedom papers or no? She told me once that a piece of paper could buy you out of bondage, but it couldn't buy you a single soul's respect. That you had to go on earning that yourself every single day, over and over, for as long as you lived. And do you believe that? That it has to be earned new each day? I did for a long while. I'm not so certain anymore. She looked at him sideways in the fading light. Sitting here most evenings, I find myself wondering whether some respect might simply be given freely by the right sort of person, without my having to prove myself all over again first. Nathaniel considered that for a long moment, watching the last color drain out of the sky above the cotton rows. Then let me be that sort of person, if I can manage it. I don't imagine I'll always get it right, but I'd rather try honestly and fail now and again than go on the way I've been. Careful and safe and entirely alone. They sat in a silence that neither felt any need to fill, and it was in exactly that kind of silence that Odessa would later tell Patience she first understood she had begun, against every careful instinct she'd spent a lifetime building, to trust this particular man with something far more fragile than her freedom papers. It was around this same time that an incident nearly drove them apart, before whatever was growing between them could take proper root. Nathaniel, wanting to share one of the few pleasures that still made him feel unburdened, invited Odessa to ride out early one morning to a rise above the fields, where the whole of Millbrook's land could be seen spread out below. Odessa, however, had never learned to sit a horse with any real ease. A lifetime of walking, of carrying and hauling, had never once included the particular privilege of riding for pleasure. And when Nathaniel noticed her discomfort mounting the second horse, hesitating with one hand on the pommel, and her jaw set tight against admitting it, he suggested without thinking that she might simply walk alongside while he rode. Something in her face closed over at once, quick and complete as a shutter drawn against weather. So now I'm to walk behind while you ride ahead in comfort. Is that how it's meant to look from the hands' quarters when they see us pass? The master mounted, and the woman he keeps trailing along on foot beside him. That isn't. Nathaniel began, but she had already turned the horse's head back, toward the house. Forgive me if I'd rather turn back than make a spectacle of myself in front of the hands. Her voice had gone flat, controlled in the particular way he had come to recognize, meant she was holding something much larger in check. Ashamed at once of his own carelessness, Nathaniel caught up to her before she'd gone far on foot, leading his own horse rather than ride while she walked. I'm sorry, Odessa. I said it without thinking, the way a man does when he's never had to consider whether the easy way suits everyone the same. That's precisely the trouble, Nathaniel. Folks born into ease rarely stop to think of those of us who had to work out every single thing for ourselves with no one's help at all. You meant nothing cruel by it, I know that. But meaning no cruelty isn't the same as doing no harm. They stood in silence a long while, the two horses shifting and stamping at flies in the heat, before Nathaniel, with a patience he hadn't known he possessed, offered to teach her himself. Slowly, with no hurry at all, as many afternoons as it might take, on foot beside her the whole while. If that was what she needed, she accepted warily at first, and over the following weeks, between clumsy falls and shared laughter that gradually wore down the sting of that first misstep, she learned not only to ride with confidence, but to trust that Nathaniel was willing to learn from his own mistakes, rather than simply defend them out of pride. There was folded inside the same leather document case that held her manumission paper a second piece of paper Odessa rarely showed to anyone. A short letter, the handwriting uneven and clearly the work of someone who had taught herself her letters late in life, one careful word at a time. She showed it to Nathaniel one warm evening in early July, several weeks after the stone had come through her window, when the conversation on the porch had turned, gently, and without either of them quite planning it, toward the subject of mothers. She wrote this to me the year before she died. Odessa said, unfolding it with the same careful reverence she gave the manumission paper itself. I was already grown and gone into service with the Poots by then. She'd never had much schooling, but she made herself learn enough to write me this much, at least in her own hand, rather than pay a scribe to do it for her. Nathaniel read it slowly, and then read it a second time over, understanding at once why she guarded it so closely. It was not a long letter, barely a page. The words simple and sometimes misspelled, but it told in its plain, unadorned way of 6 years spent taking in other women's washing after her own freedom was purchased, of coins saved a few pennies at a time in a tin buried beneath the cabin floor, of the particular joy of walking into the county courthouse at last with enough silver to buy her daughter's freedom outright, so that no man alive could ever again decide what became of her without your own say in the matter. She never once complained of the years it took her, Odessa said, her voice steadier than her eyes. 6 years of other women's dirty linen. And she wrote to me about it, as though it had been nothing at all, as though buying my freedom was simply the ordinary business of being my mother. It wasn't nothing, Nathaniel said quietly. It was everything a person could give another, short of their own life. That's precisely what it cost her in the end, near enough. She never was strong after those years of standing over the wash tub in all weather, and she passed not 4 years after I was free of my own bond. I've often wondered whether the freedom she bought me cost her every year she might have had left to enjoy watching me live it. Nathaniel folded the letter back along its careful creases and returned it to her hands, rather than to the document case. Then I think the truest way to honor what she gave you is not to spend your life guarding it in silence, out of fear it might be taken back. It's to live it as loudly and as fully as she'd have wanted for you. Odessa said nothing for a long moment, watching the last light drain out of the cotton rows below the porch. You have a way, Nathaniel Corbin, of saying exactly the thing I didn't know I needed to hear until you've already said it, Odessa told him, and reached over to take his hand, where it rested on the porch rail, holding it a long moment in the deepening dusk. Before either of them spoke again of anything at all, Isaiah himself had lived on Millbrook's land since before Nathaniel was born. Having come to the plantation as a young man of 20, when Nathaniel's grandfather first cleared the fields, and he carried in his memory a fuller history of the place than any ledger Nathaniel had ever kept. He had buried a wife on that land, and 2 children lost to fevers no doctor had ever been summoned quickly enough to treat, and had watched 3 generations of Corbins grow from infants into men without once being asked his own opinion on a single matter of consequence, until Odessa's arrival began slowly to change the pattern of things at Millbrook. It was this history, unspoken but always present, that made his quiet warnings carry the particular weight they did. A man who had survived 40 years of careful watching, who understood exactly how quickly a comfortable arrangement could turn dangerous for those with the least power to protect themselves within it. I've seen schemes like Whitmore before, Mr. Nathaniel, he said the evening he brought the warning about Bowart District to Nathaniel's study. Different names, different faces, but always the same shape to it. A man with debts and a grudge, and a woman with no jury to speak for her. I lost a cousin that way back when I was younger than you are now. Free as air, papers and all. Taken up on a claim not one word of which was ever proven true. And gone south before anybody thought to fight it properly. I don't aim to watch that happen again under this roof. Not while I've got breath left to warn against it. It was Isaiah who some weeks later found the way to warn them both of a danger far graver than any misplaced comment on horseback. He had heard during a visit to town for supplies that Silas Whitmore had sent a man south to Beaufort District, making quiet inquiries about a woman answering Odessa's description, and had begun speaking in certain company of a fugitive named Diner who'd escaped a Mr. Ezra Colerane's rice plantation nearly a year past. A woman he claimed matched Odessa's height and build closely enough to be worth investigating. There's no truth to it, surely, Nathaniel said, alarmed when Isaiah told him privately one evening. Truth's got little enough to do with it, Mr. Nathaniel, and you know it well as I do. A man like Whitmore doesn't need truth. He needs a commissioner willing to sign a paper, and enough silver to make sure the paper says what he wants it to. Isaiah told him further that Silas's man had returned from Beaufort with no real documentation at all, only the word of two men willing for a price to swear whatever oath was required. It was, Isaiah said grimly, exactly the kind of scheme the law of the land now made easy for men like Whitmore. And it was in that moment, sitting alone in his study with the candle burning low, that Nathaniel understood he could no longer afford the comfortable silence he had lived inside his whole adult life. Before we continue, it's worth pausing here to explain the real legal ground beneath everything Odessa was facing, because understanding it makes clear exactly how much danger a free black woman carried with her in the antebellum South, even with lawful papers in hand. Free black people made up a small but real population across the slaveholding states, most having gained freedom through manumission, self-purchase, or birth to a free mother. But their freedom was never secure in the way white Southerners understood the term. After the failed 1822 uprising planned by Denmark Vesey, a free black man in Charleston, South Carolina's legislature tightened restrictions dramatically. Manumission itself required special legislative approval after 1820. Free black people already in the state faced constant demands to produce documentation proving their status, and free black sailors arriving in Charleston's harbor could be jailed for the duration of their ships, stay under the state's Negro Seaman Acts. A single lost or stolen paper, a single false accusation from someone with money and standing, could unravel a lifetime of lawful freedom in an afternoon. This was the world Odessa Vane carried inside her, folded and worn soft every single day of her life, a single sheet of paper standing between herself and everything Silas Whitmore was now quietly setting in motion against her. Let's return now to Millbrook, where that danger was about to arrive at the front door in the form of two strangers and a rope. The weeks that followed passed under tension. No one at Millbrook spoke of directly, but everyone privately felt. The household moving through its daily rhythms, meals prepared, fields tended, ledgers balanced, with the particular careful quiet of people waiting for a storm they could sense but not yet see. Nathaniel found himself unable to concentrate properly on any of the plantation's ordinary business, catching himself more than once staring out the study window toward the road, watching for riders who did not come. At least not yet. Nathaniel wrote quietly to a Charleston attorney of his family's acquaintance, a careful, precise man named Josiah Kane, asking him to look into the law surrounding claims made under the new federal Fugitive Slave Act, passed only 2 years before, and to advise him on how best to protect Odessa should Whitmore's scheme come to a head. What Kane wrote back gave Nathaniel little comfort. Under the Act, any person accused of being a fugitive slave could be brought before a federal commissioner, not a judge, and denied the right to a jury trial altogether. Worse still, the accused was barred by law from testifying in their own defense. The accusation would stand or fall on documents, and the sworn word of others alone, with Odessa herself required to sit silent through the entire proceeding, while her own freedom was argued over her head. "I won't let them take you," Nathaniel told her one night after Isaiah's warning had made the danger plain to them both, breaking for the first time the formal distance they had kept even in private. "Whatever it costs me, whatever I have to sell or mortgage, you are not leaving this house against your will." "Why are you doing this, Nathaniel?" she asked him. "You could simply let this pass you by. Let Whitmore have his way. Spare yourself the trouble with your mother, the county, your own standing. It would be so much easier for you in the long run." "Because I don't want it easier, Odessa. Not if easier means losing you." It was the first time either of them had said aloud, however plainly, what had been growing quietly between them for months. And it was that same night that Odessa finally showed him the manumission paper she had carried folded against her body every day since she was 12 years old. "This was my mother's," she told him, unfolding it with careful hands under the lamplight. "She scrubbed other women's linens for 6 years to buy my freedom after she'd bought her own. If I lose it now to a man like Whitmore, it won't just be my freedom taken. It'll be everything she worked herself half to death to give me." Nathaniel held the paper, as though it might crumble in his hands, understanding for the first time the full weight of what that single sheet represented. "You won't lose it," he told her. "Not while I have breath to fight for you." The strangers came at dawn, exactly as Isaiah had feared. 2 hired men and a third carrying a folded claim bearing the name of Ezra Coleraine and a hastily sworn description that could, with enough imagination and enough silver changing hands, be made to fit almost any tall woman in the Carolina Midlands. It was the scene with which this story began. Nathaniel coming off the porch at a run, his voice roaring with a fury the whole county would talk about for months afterward, refusing to let the men take Odessa from his own yard, without a fight neither side expected to end quickly. It did not end quickly. What followed was a federal hearing held in Columbia, before a commissioner named Hollis Barrow, a heavy, set man with tired eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over a great many such proceedings, and long ago stopped expecting any of them to trouble his sleep. The room was small, close, and airless, paneled entirely in dark wood, and Odessa sat through 2 full days, unable to speak a single word in her own defense, forced instead to watch her freedom argued over her head, as though she were a parcel of disputed property, rather than a woman with a voice of her own. The first of Whitmore's hired men, a lean, sunburned man named Garrett, took the stand first, swearing under oath that he had personally overseen the woman called Dinah at Ezra Colerane's rice plantation for the better part of 2 years before her escape. "Describe her for the commissioner," Kane said, rising slowly from his chair, his voice mild and unhurried in a way that put witnesses at ease just before he began dismantling them. "Her scar, for instance. I understand she carried a burn scar along her left forearm from a kitchen accident some years back." Garrett hesitated only a fraction of a second too long. "That's right, left forearm like you said. I said nothing of the kind," Kane replied evenly, and let the silence that followed do the rest of the work for him. "I invented that scar a moment ago, sir, to see whether you would agree to it." Miss Vane bears no such mark, and you have just sworn under oath to a wound that does not exist." A murmur moved through the small room. Commissioner Barrow's pen paused over his papers. Garrett's face went the color of old ash, and his answers grew shorter and less certain for the remainder of his testimony, contradicting himself twice more on the color of Dinah's eyes and the exact circumstances of her disappearance from Colerane's land. The second witness fared little better, unable to produce so much as a signature from the Ezra Coleraine. He claimed to represent, and when Kane pressed him on why no bill of sale, no runaway notice, no correspondence of any kind bearing Colerane's own hand had been produced in 2 full days of proceedings, the man could only mutter that, "Mr. Coleraine don't hold much with paperwork," a claim that drew open disbelieving laughter from several men gathered at the back of the room. Mrs. Puig's sworn affidavit was read aloud on the second morning. 11 years of Odessa's lawful employment with the Puig household documented in careful, precise language, alongside a second letter from the Virginia court clerk's office, confirming the authenticity of the original manumission record. Obtained through weeks of careful correspondence Kane had initiated the very night Nathaniel first told him of Whitmore's scheme. Nathaniel himself took the stand, as well testifying plainly to Odessa's character, to the months of her presence at Millbrook, to the sheer implausibility of a woman managing a household's accounts and correspondence, while somehow also being a fugitive from a plantation 200 miles distant. Throughout all of it, Odessa sat perfectly still beside Kane, hands folded in her lap, forbidden by the law itself from rising to speak a single word in her own defense, no matter how badly she wished to, watching her entire life reduced to a contest between other people's testimony. It was, she would tell Nathaniel much later, the longest silence she had ever been made to keep, and the most frightening. Not because she doubted the truth, but because the truth in that room counted for so little against the color of ink on a page and the confidence of a stranger's sworn word. It was not a certain victory, and everyone in that room understood how easily it might have gone the other way. Commissioners were paid more for ruling a person, a fugitive, than for ruling them free, and countless others across the South, with papers every bit as lawful as Odessa's, had been sent south into bondage on evidence far thinner than Whitmore's collapsing story. But Kane's relentless unraveling of the hired men's testimony, combined with the sheer weight of documented evidence on Odessa's side, was enough. Commissioner Barrow removed his spectacles, rubbed his eyes for a long moment, and delivered his ruling in a flat, unceremonious voice that gave no indication of how close the matter might have gone under a less thorough attorney. The claim against Odessa Vane could not stand, and the matter of Silas Whitmore's role in bringing a fraudulent claim would be referred for further investigation. Odessa did not weep until they were outside the courthouse in the bright ordinary sunlight of a Columbia afternoon, and even then she wept only briefly, pressed against Nathaniel's shoulder, while Kane stood a respectful distance away, pretending to study his papers. "I believed you," Nathaniel said quietly into her hair. "Every moment of it. I want you to know that even when I couldn't speak for you either, I believed you completely." "I know," she said. "I could feel it sitting beside me." It was the only thing that made the silence bearable. Silas never faced serious consequence for the scheme, beyond a ruined name across 2 counties, and the quiet withdrawal of several business partners who wanted no part of a man exposed as a fraud before a federal commissioner. He sold his land within the year and was not heard from again in that part of the state. It was in the weeks following the hearing that Margaret Corbin's long resistance finally began slowly, and against her own considerable stubbornness to crack. A fever swept through the quarters that autumn, the kind of seasonal sickness that moved fastest among children. And it was Odessa who spent 3 consecutive nights without proper sleep, sitting beside the cot of a young girl named Bess, Isaiah's youngest granddaughter, pressing cool cloths to the child's forehead and spooning broth between her lips whenever she stirred enough to swallow. Margaret, unable to sleep herself for worry over what the fever might yet do to the household, found herself standing in the doorway of the sick room past midnight on the second night, watching Odessa work with a patience and tenderness that matched nothing in the old woman's careful catalogue of the many faults she had assigned her son's unwelcome guest. "You needn't trouble yourself out of bed for this, Mrs. Corbin," Odessa said quietly, not turning from the child. "I have it well in hand." "I can see that you do," Margaret said, and there was something in her voice neither woman had heard there before. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something considerably softer than the cold formality she had maintained for months. She came further into the room, and after a long hesitation, took up a second cloth and began, without further comment, to help. They sat together the rest of that night in near silence, tending the child by turns. And though neither spoke of it afterward, something had shifted in the room that would not fully reverse itself again. Margaret began in small and grudging ways to soften a civil word at breakfast, where before there had been none, a willingness to ask Odessa's opinion on a matter of the household rather than simply issue instructions past her. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and certainly not the full acceptance Margaret would only manage years later in Ohio. Watching her granddaughter, Ruth, grow tall and fearless in a way that reminded her more than she cared to admit of the very woman she had once tried to bribe into leaving. But it was a beginning, and Nathaniel, watching his mother fold a fresh cloth with the same careful hands she had once used to write furious letters demanding Odessa's removal, understood that some frozen thing in his mother's heart had finally, at long last, begun to thaw. The hearing changed something permanent in Nathaniel that even he had not fully anticipated. Sitting in that commissioner's chamber, watching a woman he loved forbidden by law from speaking a single word in defense of her own freedom, he understood with a clarity that left him sick to his stomach that he could no longer go on running Millbrook exactly as it had always been run, profiting from the same system of bondage that had so nearly taken Odessa from him, on nothing more than a forged claim and a stranger's greed. It took him the better part of a year to arrange what came next, working quietly with Kane and with a Quaker land agent in Ohio recommended through Mrs. Puig's Charleston connections. South Carolina law made it nearly impossible to free the people enslaved on his land while remaining in the state. Manumission required a special act of the legislature that was rarely granted and often refused outright. But nothing prevented a man from relocating and from formally manumitting the people in his household once he stood on free soil. Before any of that arrangement began in earnest, though, there was a quieter matter Nathaniel had waited long enough to settle. He asked Odessa to walk with him one evening to the old oak at the edge of the north pasture, a quiet spot away from the house where the two of them had taken to walking together some evenings after supper. And it was there, with no ceremony beyond the two of them and the evening birds settling quietly into the branches overhead, that he asked her plainly and without rehearsal to be his wife. "I know I can't offer you a wedding within the law of this state," he said, holding both her hands in his voice unsteady in a way she had rarely heard from him. "Not here, not in South Carolina, not so long as the law of this place refuses to recognize what I already know to be true in my own heart. But I mean to give you that wedding somewhere the law won't stand between us, if you'll have me. And I mean to spend whatever years I'm given making certain you never again have to wonder whether you're wanted exactly as you are." Odessa was quiet long enough that a barn owl called twice from somewhere in the darkening pasture before she answered. "I never once let myself imagine being asked this, Nathaniel. Not truly. A woman built the way I'm built, free or not, doesn't generally get asked. Then I'm glad to be the first fool with sense enough to ask it," he said, and she laughed then, a full surprised laugh that broke the tension of the moment entirely.
"Yes,"
she told him. "Yes, on free soil, under whatever law will finally let us stand as equals before it." It was that promise more than anything else that steadied Nathaniel through the difficult year of arrangements that followed. The quiet letters to the Ohio land agent, the slow, careful work of settling Millbrook's affairs, and the far harder work of convincing himself piece by piece that the life he had built on land, worked by enslaved hands, was not a life he could go on living, whatever comfort it had once offered him. He would say in later years that the year between the proposal under the old oak and the morning the wagons finally rolled north was the hardest and most necessary year of his entire life. Harder even than the hearing itself, because it asked of him not courage in a single dramatic moment, but the slower, less glamorous courage of dismantling piece by careful piece everything he had once believed was simply the natural order of things. Cain proved himself invaluable in more than the matter of the hearing alone. It was he who traveled personally to the Virginia County Courthouse, where Odessa's manumission had first been recorded, spending the better part of a week combing through dusty record books to secure a certified copy of the original entry, working late into each evening by candlelight, in a rented room above the county clerk's office, and writing back to Nathaniel almost daily with news of his progress, however small. It was he, too, who quietly began, months before Whitmore's scheme ever surfaced, making inquiries into the man's finances and reputation among Charleston's banking circles. Information that would later prove useful in explaining to Commissioner Barrow exactly what manner of debts might drive a man to attempt so reckless a fraud. "You've done more for this matter than any fee I've paid you could properly cover," Nathaniel told him once. Over supper at Cain's modest Charleston home, the two men lingering long after the meal itself had been cleared away, deep in conversation about the case and about the wider injustices it represented. "I'd do it gladly, Corbin. And not only for the fee," Cain replied, pouring them both a second glass of the modest claret he kept for occasions such as this one. "I've watched too many free men and women lose everything they'd built for themselves to schemes, exactly like Whitmore's, with no attorney troubled enough to fight it properly. If I can tip the scale even once in the other direction, I'll count the effort well spent, whatever it costs me in time or coin." Isaiah was the first Nathaniel told of the Ohio plan itself, sitting with him on the porch one evening, much as they had 100 times before. "I mean to sell Millbrook, Isaiah, and move north to Ohio, and I want you and your family to come, free, with land of your own waiting when we arrive, if you're willing." The old man was quiet a long while before he answered, his eyes wet in the fading evening light. "Took you long enough, Mr. Nathaniel," he said finally, and there was no bitterness whatsoever in it, only a lifetime's worth of patience finally, quietly rewarded. "But I'd say you got there." The morning they left Millbrook for the last time, Nathaniel stood alone for a while on the porch, where he had once come off the steps at a run to defend a woman that armed strangers had meant to take by force. watching the sun come up over fields he would never work again. It was not an easy grief, leaving the only land he had ever known, and he did not pretend to himself that it was. The house held Sarah's memory, as much as it held every other year of his life, and some part of him would always feel the loss of walking away from the place where he had first learned, however painfully, what it meant to see another person clearly. Odessa found him there and stood beside him without speaking for a while, understanding the particular weight of what he was setting down. "You don't have to feel nothing about leaving it, Nathaniel," she said finally. "It's your home you're leaving. Whatever else it also was, grief for a place isn't the same as regret for the choice." "I know that," he said quietly. "I only wonder sometimes whether it's a coward's grief. Mourning the comfort of a life I know now was built on something I can't in good conscience go on defending." "It's a human grief," she told him. "I don't think there's any shame in feeling the loss of a place, even a place that held wrong inside it alongside everything else. What matters is what you're walking toward, not just what you're leaving." She squeezed his hand once firmly, and the two of them stood together a while longer in the early light, saying nothing further, needing nothing further said. The wagons were loaded by mid-morning, the last of the household's belongings settled among crates and trunks. And it was Isaiah, standing at the head of the small caravan, with his family gathered around him, who spoke the words that seemed to everyone present to properly close that chapter of all their lives. "40 years I worked this ground, Mr. Nathaniel, never once walking it as a free man. I don't reckon I'll miss the fields themselves over much, but I'll not forget that it was under this roof I finally got to see the day I'd stopped believing I'd live to see." He looked out over the cotton rows a final time, then climbed up onto the lead wagon beside his grandson, and did not look back again as the caravan pulled away down the long drive toward the road north. Patience chose to come as well, and by the following spring Millbrook Plantation had been sold, its people freed and resettled on modest farmland outside a small Ohio town where Nathaniel and Odessa were married in a small stone church that placed no law between them. Margaret standing stiffly in the front pew, still not entirely reconciled to it all, but present nonetheless, having chosen in the end her son's happiness over the county's opinion of her. The wagons arrived outside the small Ohio town on a bright afternoon in early April. The whole traveling party dust, covered and weary from 3 weeks on the road, Nathaniel and Odessa, Margaret riding stiffly beside them, Isaiah and his family, Patience, and a dozen others from Millbrook who had chosen freedom and an uncertain northern future over whatever comfort remaining, enslaved in South Carolina, might have offered them. The Quaker land agent, a soft-spoken man named Elijah Comstock, met them at the edge of town with a small delegation of local free black families who had heard through the quiet networks that carried such news along the roads north that a group was arriving who would need help finding their footing. "You'll want for nothing you can't ask for plainly," Comstock told them, shaking Nathaniel's hand, and then, with equal courtesy, Isaiah's. A small but deliberate gesture that was not lost on anyone standing in that dusty road. "This town's not without its own troubles. I won't pretend otherwise. But there's land enough and neighbors enough with the decency to leave a body in peace to work it." That first evening, the town's small free black congregation held an impromptu gathering at their modest clapboard church. Tables set up outdoors beneath the new spring leaves, women from the community arriving with dishes of cornbread and stewed greens and fried chicken, enough to feed twice the number who'd traveled north. Patience, standing amid the unfamiliar faces with a plate balanced in one hand, found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, at some joke made by a woman named Cora, who ran the town's only proper bakery and who would within a year become one of Patience's closest friends. Odessa stood a little apart from the gathering for a while that evening, watching the lantern light move across faces that held none of the careful wariness she had spent a lifetime reading in strangers' eyes. And it was Nathaniel who found her there and asked quietly what she was thinking. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I have never once in my life stood in a crowd this size and felt certain all the way down that not a single person here meant me harm. I don't quite know what to do with the feeling. It sits strange after so many years of the opposite." "Then let it sit as long as it needs to," he told her. "I imagine it'll grow more familiar with time." It did, though not without its own slower griefs and adjustments. The farmhouse they built together outside that Ohio town was smaller than Millbrook's grand columned house had ever been, and neither of them missed the difference for a single day. Isaiah's grandson, the same boy who had once traced his letters in the dirt behind a smokehouse by borrowed candlelight, grew up attending the small local school openly without fear, and was by all accounts the sharpest hand at figures the county schoolmaster had taught in a decade. Isaiah himself lived another 11 years on his own patch of free land, dying peacefully in his sleep one winter morning with his whole family gathered close around him. A death Nathaniel would later say was the first he had ever attended that felt, despite the grief of it, entirely and properly peaceful. Patience kept her own kitchen at last in a small house not a quarter mile from Nathaniel and Odessa's farm, taking in boarders, and within a few years married a free blacksmith named Amos who had settled in the same town after buying his own freedom in Kentucky. She and Odessa remained close for the rest of their lives, the two women who had first taken each other's measure over a pot of hominy grits in a Carolina kitchen, now raising their children within sight of one another's chimney smoke. Nathaniel and Odessa had 3 children of their own in the years that followed. First a daughter they named Ruth, who grew tall as her mother and twice as stubborn, then a son, Samuel, who took after his father's quiet carefulness with numbers and ledgers, and finally, years later, a second daughter they named simply Grace, born the same spring Margaret Corbin, grown gentle and reflective in her old age, finally admitted to her granddaughter Ruth that she had been wrong, in ways she was only now old enough to properly understand, about a great many things she had once believed unshakable truths. Ruth grew up hearing the story of her parents, meeting so many times, told by so many different voices around the farmhouse table, that she could recite pieces of it herself by the age of 6, standing on a kitchen chair to act out her father's furious dash across the Millbrook yard, while Patience's children shrieked with delighted laughter at her dramatics. She grew tall exactly as her mother had, taller than every boy in her small schoolhouse by the time she was 12, and where other girls her age might have shrunk from the attention such height drew. Ruth instead carried it the way she had watched her mother carry it her whole life, chin level, shoulders back, entirely unapologetic. When a schoolyard boy once made the mistake of mocking her size within her mother's hearing, Odessa said nothing to the boy at all, only knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes and told her quietly enough that only Ruth could hear, "You come from women who were never once made small by anybody's opinion of them. Don't you start now." Ruth never forgot it, and neither in time did the boy, who grew up to marry a woman nearly as tall as Ruth herself, and would later claim, with some embarrassment, that the lesson had taken root in him earlier than he cared to admit. Samuel, quieter than his older sister, and more inclined toward his father's careful, methodical temperament, took to the farm's account books almost as soon as he could hold a pencil steady, and it became a standing joke in the household, repeated fondly at nearly every family gathering for years afterward, that no chore involving arithmetic could be assigned to anyone else so long as Samuel was within earshot of the request. He would grow up to keep the farm's books himself in time, and later still to help several of the town's free black families establish small businesses of their own, having learned early at his mother's side that a mastery of figures was a form of protection as much as a practical skill. That a man who could read his own accounts clearly could never again be as easily cheated as Millbrook's own overseer had once tried to cheat his father. Grace, the youngest, arrived nearly a decade after Ruth, born into a household already settled and steady in a way her older siblings' earliest years had never quite been, and grew up with none of the wariness that had shaped so much of her mother's own girlhood. A difference the whole family noticed and quietly, privately celebrated. She was, by everyone's account, the most easily delighted of the three children, prone to long afternoons spent trailing after Patience in the garden or sitting at her grandmother Margaret's knee, demanding, just as Ruth once had, the story of the yard and the rope and her father's furious voice, breaking the dawn silence. It was Grace who decades later would be the one to finally write the whole account down in her own careful hand, determined that her own children and grandchildren should have it preserved beyond the fading memory of whoever happened to be telling it around the supper table on any given evening. Mrs. Poot herself lived long enough to visit the Ohio farm twice before her death, an arduous journey she undertook each time with evident delight, declaring on her second visit that Odessa's garden put her own Charleston roses to shame, and that she took no small measure of pride in having, however accidentally, set the whole improbable chain of events in motion. On that same visit, she brought news that Cato, the quiet driver who had carried Odessa up that first dusty road so many years before, had finally purchased his own freedom after decades of careful saving, and had asked particularly that Mrs. Poot pass along his regards to the tall lady who never did turn out to be who everybody expected. Odessa wept at the message and wrote him a long letter of her own that same evening, the first of what would become a regular correspondence between them for the rest of Cato's life. Cain, too, remained a lifelong friend and correspondent, and it was through his continued legal work, quieter now, though no less determined, that a dozen other free black families across the Carolinas found their own freedom papers defended against schemes, not unlike Whitmore's in the years that followed. Cases Nathaniel helped fund from Ohio, without ever asking to have his name attached to the effort. Patience and Odessa remained until the end of both their long lives, exactly what they had first become over a pot of hominy grits in a Carolina kitchen. The closest of friends, bound by a history neither needed to explain to the other, a bond that deepened rather than faded with every passing year of shared Ohio winters. Their children grew up as near to siblings as two families not joined by blood could manage, running between the two farmhouses so often and so freely that visitors passing through town sometimes struggled to determine which children properly belonged to which mother, a confusion neither Odessa nor Patience were much troubled themselves to correct. Margaret spent her final years in the small house behind Nathaniel and Odessa's own, and it was Ruth, more than anyone, who drew the old woman out of her long-held silences, climbing into her lap on autumn afternoons and demanding again and again the story of how her father had once shouted down two armed strangers in a Carolina yard for a woman everyone else had told him to send away. Margaret told it a little differently each time, the details softening and warming with each retelling, until by the last year of her life the story had become, in her own telling of it, the proudest moment of her son's entire life, rather than the scandal she had once dreaded above all others. And so on a modest farm beneath an open Ohio sky, far from the cotton fields and courtroom silences of Millbrook, Nathaniel and Odessa built the life neither of them had believed themselves permitted to want. Isaiah's grandson learned his letters openly now, with no need for darkness or a stick in the dirt behind a smokehouse, and grew in time into a respected schoolteacher himself, the first in the family's memory to stand at the front of a classroom, rather than sit hidden at its edges. Patience kept a kitchen of her own at last, answering to no one, her table always crowded on Sunday afternoons with a gathering of children who called her Olt, whether or not they shared a drop of her blood. Odessa kept her mother's letter and her manumission paper together still, safe in the same worn leather case, though she no longer felt the need to carry it pressed against her body, every waking hour, the way she once had. It lived instead in a small cedar box on the mantel of the farmhouse she and Nathaniel had built together, taken down now and again on quiet evenings to be read aloud to Ruth, and later to Ruth's own children, not as a relic of danger survived, but as a record of exactly what it had cost, and exactly what it had been worth, for a woman to insist for her entire life on being seen as fully human in a world that had so often refused her that simplest of courtesies. She would tell her grandchildren in later years, gathered close around her on the same porch, where she had once packed a bag she never used. That freedom had never once been the single sheet of paper her mother had scrubbed 6 years of other women's linens to purchase. Precious as that paper had been, freedom, she came to understand, sitting on a porch that finally fully belonged to her, was the whole of what came after. The standing tall in a crowded market despite the stares, the refusing of a bribe meant to shrink her out of a room, the silence endured in a federal hearing chamber, and the voice found again on the far side of it, the choosing every single morning for the rest of her life to walk into whatever room waited for her exactly as she was, and to wait for no one's permission to belong there. Before we close this story, it's worth taking a moment to place these events within the fuller and often harsher history that shaped them. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, passed as part of the broader compromise of that year, was among the most severe pieces of legislation of the antebellum period, denying accused fugitives any right to testify, any right to a jury, and placing enormous financial incentive on commissioners to rule against the accused. The danger it created for free black Americans was not hypothetical. Solomon Northup was freed black man from New York, was kidnapped in Washington, D.C. in 1841 and sold into slavery in Louisiana, where he remained enslaved for 12 years despite holding lawful proof of his freedom. A case that became widely known through his own written account and stands as one of the best documented examples of exactly the danger Odessa faced at Millbrook. Free black communities across the South lived under this constant precariousness throughout the 1850s, even as the Underground Railroad carried thousands north to freedom, and the abolitionist movement grew louder in the decade leading up to the Civil War. Full legal freedom for enslaved Americans would not arrive until the 13th Amendment's ratification in December of 1865, more than a decade after the events of this story. A reminder that the happiness Nathaniel and Odessa found in Ohio came only because they had left the law of South Carolina behind them entirely, not because that law had changed. Years later, on a quiet Ohio evening, not so different from 100 others, Nathaniel Corbin sat beside the woman who had arrived at his door by pure accident and stayed by nothing but her own choosing, watching the light go down gold over land that belonged to no one but themselves. Odessa vain, Odessa Corbin now, though she answered just as readily to either, had never once stopped insisting. From the very first morning she stepped down from that carriage in place of a bride no one ever met, on being seen exactly as she was. It had taken a federal hearing, a fraud exposed, an entire life uprooted and rebuilt on free soil, to finally win her the plain ordinary right every person deserves without having to fight for it at all. But she had it now, whole and unshakable, and she meant to keep it for the rest of her days.